Well, let's just pray as we open God's Word and see what He wants to tell us. God, we are opening up your Word because that's why you wrote it, so we read it. And we want to read it. We want to know what your words say. We want to know what they mean. We want to know what they mean for us right now. So God, they're not only words, they are, as you have said, living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword, cutting even between soul and spirit. When we read your words, they're alive. They speak to us. They challenge us. They change us. You tell us that your words teach us and correct us and rebuke us and train us so that we might be equipped for every good work. You want us to know you because you have work for us to do to build your kingdom. And we can't do that if we don't know you and your word. So teach us. Open the eyes of our hearts that indeed we might know you better this morning. I ask in your name, Jesus. Amen. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, I was watching, along with my family, we're watching the Disney movie Aladdin. You've probably watched Aladdin. I like watching Disney movies. In Aladdin, there's this line that is repeated twice. It's repeated it starts in the beginning of the movie and it's repeated somewhere close to the end. It's the line that says Aladdin stretches out his hand and he offers it up to Princess Jasmine and he says, "Do you trust me?" The first time it happens is they are running away from the guards because they were considered thieves in the marketplace. They'd stolen something. They're running away, and they're running along the rooftops, and Aladdin needs to jump from one rooftop to the next, and it's a large gap in between, and they get there, and Jasmine hesitates, and he turns and he says, "Do you trust me?" So she takes his hand, and she jumps with him. The second time it happens in the movie is a little while past, maybe 3/4 the way through. He is masquerading as a prince, and he's on the balcony of the palace and Jasmine's quarters, and he is standing on a magic carpet. Yes, only Disney. But he's standing on a magic carpet. And she doesn't know that, and he says, "Hey, why don't you come with me, and I want to take you on this magic carpet ride," kind of thing. And she says, "Well, how are you doing that?" And he holds up his hand, and he says, "Do you trust me?" And so she takes his hand and she jumps over the balcony, lands on the magic carpet, and away they go for a ride. That line, every time it happens in that movie, every time I see it, "Do you trust me?" I think of God. I think of God reaching out his hand to us and saying, "Do you trust me? Do you trust me?" Because he's always doing that for us. And I think that we have very similar responses to the line, "Do you trust me?" Sometimes it's easy for us to say, "Well, sure, I trust you. Yeah, I trust you, God," and we put our hand in his. There are other times when we say, "Well, it's going to be a little tougher. There are some hesitations I have. There are some things I wonder about. There are some things that I'd sure like some clarity on first, but okay, I trust you." And then there are times when God says, "Do you trust me?" And we say, "Oh, man, I'd like to. I mean, I'd really like to get there. But, this is pretty big. It's pretty serious. This is pretty emotional. This is pretty impactful. Like this is my life we're talking about. And God, I'm just not there." And we don't take his hand. And we don't trust him. And it's maybe not because we don't have faith. But maybe it's because we don't have faith enough. Our faith is limited. Sometimes our faith is limited to God. Or another way to put it is, sometimes we have faith, but in a limited God. We see God as limited. We wonder, can God do this? Will God do this? Is he capable of doing this? And so we have a faith in God, but we have a faith in a limited God because we don't know his power. We don't necessarily trust his power. We're not sure When he sticks out his hand and he says, do you trust me? And our limited faith, or our faith in a limited God says, I don't know that I can. I'm not ready to put my hand out yet. And we need to know that there are times in life when we have a faith in a limited God, or a limited faith in God, however you want to put that. And I guess the question is, what happens? What happens when we have faith, but we believe in a limited God? What happens when we limit our faith in God? Well, this last story in the life of Elisha answers that question. It's the very last story in the life of Elisha. We've come to the end of our series on Elisha, and we find this last story in 2 Kings chapter 13. 2 Kings chapter 13 and verse 14. It's just a short story, but there's a lot in this story. First thing we'll notice before we even read it is that the last time we saw Elisha was back in chapter 9. Elisha showed up in chapter 9, and he had just sent one of his students to anoint Jehu as king. A lot has happened since chapter 9. In fact, right now in chapter 13, as we get into this story, we discover that there's a different king in Israel. Jehoash is king in Israel. Jehoash is the grandson of Jehu. So there's a couple of generations that have gone by since chapter 9 and chapter 13. There's a lot of time that has gone by. Jehu has been king, and then his son Jehoahaz became king, and then his son Jehoash became king. So this is the grandson of Jehu. So we know that Elisha has been a prophet for a long time. Elisha has seen a lot of kings. Elisha started his prophetic ministry with Elijah during the time of Ahab. Ahab was king of Israel. Then after Ahab, his son Ahaziah became king of Israel. And after Ahaziah, another son of Ahab became king, and his name was Joram. And after Joram, it was Jehu. Jehu was the one who destroyed Joram and his family and the whole family and line of Ahab. After Joram was Jehu, and after Jehu was Jehoahaz. And after Jehoahaz was Jehoash. That's a lot of J's. But Elisha has been a prophet for a very long time. We don't know exactly how long, but we know that Elisha is probably somewhere around 100 years old at this point. He's been in Israel a long time. Maybe he's been a prophet for 80 years. We don't know how old he was when he began with Elijah. Therefore, we're not exactly sure how old he is. Some commentators believe Elisha lived to be 120. But certainly he's around 100 anyway. And we read in verse 14 of chapter 13 of 2 Kings. Now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. Elisha is an old man. He's 100 years old or so. And he's got an illness. It's an illness from which he died. He wasn't translated into heaven like Elijah was. He wasn't taken up in a chariot or in the whirlwind, rather. He became ill. And he never recovered from that illness. And he died. And we read just after that, Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, chariots and horsemen of Israel. It's an interesting thing that Jehoash went down to see Elisha. Interesting and maybe a little bit surprising, because we know that Jehoash was not a good king. In fact, the Bible tells us in verse 11 of chapter 13 that Jehoash did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Jehoash was not committed to the ways of God. Jehoash was not committed to following God, to serving God, to worshiping God. Jehoash was committed still to the idols of Israel. It says he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam that had caused Israel to commit sin. He continued to commit them. So he wasn't necessarily a follower of God. He certainly wasn't a disciple of Jehovah. So it's surprising that he wants to go and see Elisha. Because Elisha is all about God. Elisha almost equals God. Elisha's name means God saves, and all throughout his 100 years, his 80 years of being a prophet in Israel, that is what he has been doing. He's been showing up to show that God saves every single time. Almost every one of our stories of Elisha, we see that somehow God shows up and saves. And so they're really on opposite ends of the spectrum. There's Jehoash who lives for himself, who lives for other gods, who serves other gods. Jehovah just happens to be one of the many gods he serves. But here's Elisha, who's dedicated to Jehovah. One God, the only God, the true and living God, and he's given his life over in service to him. But Jehoash goes down and weeps over him. He weeps over him. And he says, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. We've seen that phrase before. My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. We've seen that in 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 12. 2 Kings 2 and 12 is Elijah is being taken up into heaven and Elisha is with him. And Elisha sees Elijah being taken up into heaven in the whirlwind. And Elisha cries out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. What was he saying? What did it mean? What was it indicated? First of all, it was indicated, my father realizes that you have authority over me. So here's Jehoash, the king of Israel, coming to Elisha and saying, you have authority over me. You're my father. You are that person of protection. You are that person of authority, of leadership in my life. And he says, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. That was a phrase that meant you are the protector of Israel. You are the one that protects Israel. You are the power and strength of Israel. Elisha, you are the one that has been carrying Israel. In fact, it's such a true phrase in this case, especially because in 2 Kings 13:7, we read this about the army of Jehoash and Israel. 2 Kings 13:7, after he had a war with Hazael, the king of Aram, it says, nothing had been left of the army of Jehoahaz except 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. For the king of Aram destroyed the rest and made them like dust at threshing time. So Jehoash has barely got an army. He has 50 horses, 10 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers. There's not much left. It's decimated. They don't have anything. And he realizes that Elisha is the one who gives strength and power and protection to Israel. It's not his horses, it's not his chariots, it's not his armor, it's not his army. But it's been Elisha. And truly we've seen this all through the life of Elisha. Elisha is the one who went down with Joram to fight Moab. And if it wasn't for Elisha, Joram would have been wiped out. But Elisha saved them. Elisha was the one who saved Jehoash. Oh my goodness. He was the one who saved Jehoash from the Assyrians when they tried to ambush him. And Elisha would come along and say, don't go there, they're waiting in ambush. Elisha was the one who brought the Syrian army right into the very palace, the very center of Israel, and blinded them and brought them there and then sent them away. He saved Israel. Elisha was the one who just continued to intercede on behalf of Israel and save Israel. Elisha truly was the protector and the force in Israel. Jehoash realizes that without Elisha, he never would have been king. Here he is, the grandson of Jehu, whom Elisha anointed. He owes his kingship to Elisha and calls him the protector of Israel. It's interesting that the king, who's a pagan king, really recognizes the influence that godly people have in the kingdom. Nations are protected by their godly people. America is protected because of godly people. Of course, the rest of America would not say that. The rest of America is trying to get rid of Christians and get rid of disciples of Christ and get rid of God and get rid of his word. But a nation rises and falls based on the righteousness of their people. Take a look at Sodom and Gomorrah. The angel comes along and says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, well, if there's 20 people, will you save it? Yes. If there's 20 righteous people, disciples, I will save it. What about 15? Yes. What about 10? What about 5? If there are only 5 righteous people, I will save that city. I won't destroy it. But there weren't 5. And the city was destroyed. The righteousness of people, God followers, disciples of Jesus Christ, are the ones who are responsible in many ways for the well-being of a nation. That's why Satan works so hard to get rid of disciples of Christ. That's why Satan works so hard to turn the church into looking like the world. That's why Satan tries so hard to get Christians to compromise with the world and say, yeah, it doesn't matter. We don't have to be set apart. We don't have to be holy. We don't have to serve God that much. We don't have to be that committed. Let's just take God as one of the parts of our life rather than our life solely and completely. And that's the sad thing. That's the destructive thing. That's the awful thing that's happening around the world. Is that disciples of Christ become less and less committed to the ways of Christ, the holiness of God, and take upon themselves the ways of the world. So would you know the difference? How can we be salt and light when we're no longer salt and light? How can we say, I'm going to show people who Jesus is, when we ourselves are doing everything that the world does in the same measures? That's the work of Satan. And that's what destroys countries. And that's why Jehoash goes to see Elisha. And he weeps over Elisha. Because he knows that Elisha is responsible for the well-being of his country. And he doesn't know what to do without him. And he's afraid of what's going to happen. What's going to happen when Elisha leaves this world and he's no longer the protector of this country? He hardly has an army. With Elisha, it's enough. With God, it's enough. But without God, he's in trouble. So he goes to see Elisha. He goes to see Elisha not only because he realizes Elisha's influence in the country, but I think he goes for another reason. It's okay. It's a good reason. You've probably had the experience that someone you love is dying, and they're, on their last days. And so you want to rush over and see them. You want to go talk to them. You want to be with them. And you don't only want to be with them because you love them and you're going to miss them and their influence in your life and your world around you, but you're going because you want to receive something. You go because you want to hold their hand and receive the warmth of their touch. You go because maybe they'll open their eyes and recognize you. Maybe they'll squeeze your hand. Maybe they'll give you one last word of encouragement. Maybe one last look. Maybe one last embrace. but something that you can take away, something you've received from them, something that you can think on, something that's a memory that's going to be with you forever, some sort of blessing. And you go because you love them and you want to be there for them and you recognize the loss, but you're also going because you need a blessing. In ancient Near East culture, giving a blessing on your deathbed was hugely important. We know that Jacob called his sons together and gave them a blessing. Abraham blessed his son. Isaac blessed his son. There's a blessing that comes. Before they left this world, they wanted to give a blessing, words of encouragement, words of advice, words to live by, words of memory, something that would help them as they carried on life without them. Something they could say, I received this from the person I loved, and I'll hold on to that forever. It's an encouragement to keep walking. See, I think Jehoash needed encouragement to keep walking. Jehoash went to Elisha to receive a blessing, to receive encouragement, to be able to continue on and say, what am I going to do without you? And Elisha gave him a blessing and said, God will still show up in your world. Because look what he says. Verse 15. Elisha said, get a bow and some arrows. And so he did. Take the bow in your hands, he said to the king of Israel. When he had taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Open the east window, he said, and he opened it. Shoot, Elisha said, and he shot. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. Elisha declared, you will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek. So the picture is Elisha saying, get your bow and arrow. Bow and arrow, shooting that arrow towards the east, was shooting it towards Aram. It was a declaration of war. It was a symbolic act of saying, we're at war with Aram. And this battle at Aphek, the battle that's coming up, Elisha says, you will win this. He puts his hands on the hands of Jehoash. It's a symbol of God's power and God's authority on the hands of Joash. He's saying, look, I will always be with you. God's power will always be with you. Even though I am leaving, God is with you. I'm putting my hand on your hand. I am showing you that God is with you. And this next battle that you fight, I know you've been devastated by the last one. You've lost almost all your army. You have 10 chariots left, very few soldiers left. But I want to tell you that God's power will remain with you. When I go, God will stay. God is with you. And so he shoots the arrow. And he hears the words, the encouragement, the blessing that he needed to hear. The Lord's arrow of victory. The arrow of victory over Aram. But there's more. Elisha just doesn't give him that. He just doesn't give him that blessing. He wants to give him more blessing. Elisha does something. He says in verse 18, take the arrows. And the king took them. Elisha said to him, strike the ground. He struck it 3 times and stopped. Elisha was doing more than just giving him a blessing. Elisha was doing more than just saying God is with you. Elisha was trying to develop in him his own faith. Elisha was saying, don't just take it on my faith, but you need to know God with your own actions. You need to be exercising your faith. Because it's easy to depend on other people's faith, right? It's easy to say to other people, God will do this for you. Trust him, it's okay. But when it comes to our life, it's hard. It's harder for us to look in the mirror and say that we would easily say to someone else, it's okay, God will provide, God will protect, God will do this for you. When it comes to our life, we say, is he going to? I don't know. That's why we love to ask people to pray for us. And we go to people who we know are prayer warriors. They're a prayer warrior. Please, will you pray for me? I need you to pray for me. I'm not sure that my prayers are enough. I'm not sure that my prayers are answered, but I know yours are. I know you have great faith for prayer. I'm not sure where mine is, so would you pray for me? And this is what Jehoash has done with Elisha. Will you pray for me? Will you bless me? Will you promise me something that God will be with me? I need to know these things. And Elisha says, yes, he will, but you need to know something. Elisha says, you need to know that God is with your faith, and you need to have a faith in God that's your own. Don't depend on me. Don't depend on someone else. Don't depend on someone else's prayers. You need to develop a faith in God yourself. You need to know who God is. See, Jehoash doesn't really know who God is. He doesn't spend time with God. Jehovah, God is just one of many for him. And so Elisha challenges his faith. Elisha says, you need to know God yourself. You need your faith built. You need to know who God is. And so he takes the arrows and he strikes them 3 times and he stops. And look at this response by Elisha. Verse 19. The man of God was angry with him. He was angry with him. And said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times. Elisha said, why did you stop? What's the matter with you? I told you to strike the ground. Now, the phrase here, strike the ground, isn't just a one and only. Okay, the way it's written in Hebrew is strike and continuously strike. Keep striking the ground. Jehoash takes this arrow and he strikes it once, and he strikes it twice, and he strikes it 3 times. He says, that's about right. I'm not going to strike it anymore. And Elisha's lying in bed or sitting on the edge of bed, whatever it is. He's going, what are you doing? That's it? You stopped? Why did you stop? Don't you know what I just gave you and could have had? Why did you stop? See, Elisha knows that the pounding of the arrows is symbolic of a battle that he is going to win. And every time he pounds the arrow on the ground, it's a battle won. And Jehoash stops at 3. There is no command to stop at 3. There is no encouragement to stop at 3. Elisha said, pound the ground and keep pounding it. Just keep going. I'll tell you when to stop. But he pounds the ground only 3 times. And Elisha says, why'd you stop? Jehoash understands what he's doing. Okay, it's not like Jehoash goes, I don't know why I'm pounding the ground. I don't get it. Jehoash knows. He's just shot the arrow. Elisha has just put his hands on him. Elisha has just said, God will be with you. And now he said, take another arrow and strike the ground with it. Because this arrow means God's power and strength in your life. He understood that. This is Elisha the prophet. This is Elisha who knows God. This is Elisha who does miracles of God. This is Elisha who has proved that nothing is impossible with God. This is Elisha saying, pound the ground and keep pounding the ground. And Jehoash, in his unbelief, stops. 3 is good enough. 3 seems like a good number. I don't know that I want to go any more than 3. And he stops. Because he doesn't exercise his faith. He thinks God is limited. Don't we do that? We believe God is limited. There are times in our lives when we have a limited faith in God, or we believe that God is limited, however you want to say that phrase. And we put God in this box. And we say, well, God can do this and God can do that. And I imagine he could probably do that, but he can't do that. That's crazy. And we limit God to what we think he can do and what we think he will do. And we limit God to our sense of control and our sense of power. But God is not limited. God is not a limited God. And we don't need a limited faith in God. He is all-powerful. Jesus says in Matthew 19:26, all things are possible with God. All things are possible with God. But Jehoash doesn't know God. And he believes God is limited. He stops at 3. And Elisha's angry and says, You wasted it, man. You had a chance. You could have led Israel out of all of this war with Aram. You could have been successful. You could have followed God fully. You could have given yourself over to God with every ounce of who you are, but you stopped short because you don't know God, because you don't trust God, because you limit God, because you say, God, I want you to be my co-pilot, but not my pilot. Like, get your hands off the controls. Is he God in your life? Or is he a God you control in your life? For Joash, he was not God all-powerful. He was God all controlled by what Joash thought. So Elisha died, and he was buried in verse 20. Look what happens. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Hazael, king of Aram, oppressed Israel throughout the reign of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion and showed concern for them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To this day, he has been unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence. Verse 24, Hazael, king of Aram, died, and Ben-Hadad, his son, succeeded him as king. Then Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, recaptured from Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the towns he had taken in battle from his father Jehoahaz. 3 times Jehoash defeated him, and so he recovered the Israelite towns. 3 times. The 3 times he struck the arrows in the ground. He had faith for 3 times. He had a limited faith. He won 3 battles, but he could have won more. He could have won them all. He could have saved his country. Elisha wanted Jehoash to understand and exercise his faith in God. Elisha wanted Jehoahaz to trust God. Elisha wanted Jehoahaz to give himself fully over to God, who's not limited, who has all the power in the world. He's not limited in his power. He gave Jehoash the opportunity to give himself fully over to God, who is fully trustworthy and fully powerful and able to do what he says he will do. And Jehoash said no. Jehoash said, I don't trust God. Jehoash said, I don't know God well enough. Jehoash said, I think God's limited. So he looks back and he says, man, I should have done more. It's interesting, the little part in the story I kind of glossed over that all of you went, what? Wait a minute, read that again. They threw a dead man's body in Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Where did that come from? Like, that's amazing. Elisha, in his death, in his tomb, shows the power of God. See, that's why it's there. That's why it's there, is to show the power of God. See, God's power wasn't limited to Elisha's life. God's power wasn't limited to one single person or limited to anybody. God's power is unlimited. And he can do whatever he pleases to do whenever he pleases it to do it. Even through death. This guy is dead, touches Elisha's bones, and he comes back to life. I think it was a sign for Jehoahaz or Jehoash to say, look, remember I told you 3 times you're going to gain the victory? Even though he's dead and gone, Jehoahaz hears the story and goes, that's the power of God. That's the power of Elisha. And he goes on to win 3 battles. But he could have won more. This story is actually a tragedy. This story is a partial victory. What happens when we have faith in a limited God? Or what happens when we have a limited faith in God? God limits his power in our life. Who's your God? And why are you limiting him? Nothing is impossible with God. We need to exercise our faith in an unlimited, powerful God, all-powerful God. That's the faith that he wants us to exercise. He wants us to know that he is all-powerful. They say hindsight is 20/20. Sometimes so is faith. Jesus reaches out his hand and he says, do you trust me? Do you trust me? I know you can't see the end. I know you can't see the bottom. I know that you don't understand it all. I know that you've got to put your faith in me. Do you trust me? Will you put your hand in his and trust him? Because he's not limited. He is God, Most High, all-powerful. And he says, do you trust me? Trust him. Obey him. Follow him. And he will pour out his power in your life.